I am Pilar Dirickson Garrett. I'm the Associate Director of Cinema Tropical, and I'm so excited to be in conversation this evening with filmmakers David Riker, Jim McKay, and Alexis Gambis to talk about their films La Ciudad, El Séptimo Día, and Son of Monarchs, as well as to discuss their experience as non-Mexican filmmakers making landmark films about the Mexican community here in New York City. So before we get started, I'm just going to give the official bios for our three panelists, and then we'll get going. So David Riker is an award-winning director, screenwriter, and editor working across both documentary and fiction. His debut feature, La Ciudad, The City, premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival in 1998 to critical acclaim and took home awards at South by Southwest, San Sebastian, Havana, and the Human Rights Watch Film Festival, among others. His second feature film, The Girl, won the NHK Award for Best American Screenplay at the Sundance Film Festival in 2009. As a screenwriter, Riker has received a number of prestigious awards, including the Waldo Salt Screenwriting Award at Sundance in 2008 for his work with Alex Ribera on Sleep Dealer. Most recently, he co-wrote alongside Jeremy Scahill the documentary feature Dirty Wars on the Global War on Terror. The film was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 2014, as well as the Writers Guild of America Award for Best Documentary Screenplay. Riker is the recipient of Guggenheim, Rockefeller, and Annenberg Fellowships for his work as both a writer and director. And he also teaches screenwriting and directing, most recently at Columbia University's graduate film program. So happy to have you here, David. Jim McKay is a filmmaker and co-founder, along with Michael Stipe of C100 Film Corps. McKay co-wrote and directed his first feature film, Girls Town, in 1995. His second feature film, Our Song, premiered at the 2000 Sundance Film Festival, played at New Directors' New Films, and was then released theatrically by IFC Films. McKay's feature, Everyday People, was the opening night film of New Directors' New Films in 2004 and played at festivals across the country before showing on HBO. His fourth feature, Angel Rodriguez, co-written with Hannah Weir, premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival in 2005, had its US premiere at MoMA, and then showed on HBO. And his fifth feature film, and the one we're gathered to talk about tonight, El Séptimo Día, on the seventh day, premiered as the centerpiece film at BAM Cinema Fest 2017 in the international competition at the Locarno International Film Festival, also in 2017, and was theatrically released in the US by Cinema Guild in 2018. McKay has been both a Rockefeller and Guggenheim Fellow in 2003 and 2004, respectively. In 2005, he was a recipient of the Lincoln Center Martin E. Siegel Award, and in 2019, he received the Independent Spirit John Cassavetes Award for El Séptimo Día. And moving on to Alexis, our final panelist. Alexis is a French-Venezuelan filmmaker and biologist. His films combine documentary and fiction, often embracing animal perspectives and experimenting with new forms of scientific storytelling. In 2008, Gambis founded the Imagine Science Film Festival that recently celebrated its 13th year of showcasing science and film from around the world. In 2016, he launched the sister portal La Bocine, coined the Netflix for Science. It's a beauty platform that provides a virtual ecosystem to experience science cinema in all its flavors by hybridizing forms and fostering a dialogue between science artists and educators. His latest feature film, Son of Monarchs, had its home premiere at the Morelia International Film Festival in October 2020, and its international premiere at the 2021 Sundance Film Festival, where it took home the Alfred P. Sloan Prize, which is awarded every year to a film that forefronts themes of science or technology, or depicts a scientist, engineer, or mathematician as a main character. A recipient of the 2019 TED Fellowship, Gambis' TED Talk makes a case for more science in fiction in order to humanize the scientist in the public eye and to inform a broader audience on the interplay of research advancements, scientific representations, and social issues. We are all so honored to have you three here with us tonight. So without further ado, let's get started so I can pass the mic over to you guys. Cool. Hi guys. So to start off, all three of your films are fiction features based on very real world type characters and situations. La Ciudad is made up of 4 gritty stories, each chronicling an angle of the Latinx immigrant experience here in New York City. There are day laborers risking their lives to work in unsafe conditions for low pay, a father trying to get his daughter into public school without papers, a newcomer who finds love only to get lost in the unwelcoming maze of buildings that is Manhattan, and a garment worker who struggles for a paycheck that could save her daughter's life. And El Séptimo Día follows a group of friends and undocumented immigrants living and working in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. Bicycle delivery guys, construction workers, dishwashers, and deli workers, they all work long hours, 6 days a week, and then savor their one day of rest on Sundays to play soccer. And then the film follows them as that one precious day becomes threatened. Son of Monarchs tells the story of a biologist working at an undisclosed university lab in New York City while battling depression, confronting dark memories of his childhood, and grappling with the split he feels between his new world and his obligations back home in Mexico. So I think to start us off, we'd love to hear from each of you how you initially came up with the concepts for your films, what were the originating impetuses or ideas, as well as how these films fit into the previous work you were doing. Whoever would like to go first, we could just kind of do a roundtable type thing.
I guess I can jump in. I'll start. Yeah, so I think the initial idea of the film Son of Monarchs was, you know, I'm partly Venezuelan. I'm from Venezuela and also French, but living in New York. And I felt that there was, you know, there was a whole kind of aspect of representation that that I didn't see much in film, especially the Hispanic community in field. So I have a past life as a scientist. I like to refer to myself as a retired biologist at a young. I retired at a young age, but I thought that it was important to show this different type of immigration, immigration that is somewhat more privileged, but an immigration that speaks to a lot of people, and also emphasizing the fluid kind of back and forth between countries, not emphasizing kind of the hardships, but this idea that we're very mobile, and also making the analogy with animals that are constantly migrating on a yearly basis, on a seasonal basis. And so I went to Mexico a few times to kind of do research and do short films and also interview immigrant scientists, and that's sort of how I kind of came up with the idea. And then with the actor Chuerta, you know, we were just really interested in playing with, you know, what people think, you know, what is the depiction of a scientist in people's minds. And I thought it was important to kind of feature a Mexican scientist. And so that's a little bit about how it came about.
Great. David or Jim?
David's going like this. We'll go in descending order because David's film was the first of this group, right?
Exactly, yeah.
That was great to hear. I liked it, you know, I feel like I always, first of all, think about making the kind of movie that I would like to watch, which doesn't mean I only like to watch the kind of movies I make. I love seeing The Bourne Identity every time it's on television in a hotel room. But yeah, so I think about that, and then I think about what haven't I seen, and what do I feel like hasn't been made. What are the lack? Sorry.
No problem.
The thing says playing music.
Can tell you're in New York at least.
Yeah. Where are this? Where's the lack of representation? What are the stories that I haven't been told? So that plays a part in choosing what I want to do, as well as, I don't know, those moments where you're all of a sudden writing a story or a character and you don't remember why. You don't remember what I don't have any memory of thinking about a delivery worker specifically. So it always comes from different places. I did want to focus on Sunset Park. I had just finished a film called Our Song, which was based in Crown Heights and was a very much like a neighborhood film. The neighborhood was a main character in a lot of ways. And I think at that time when I started writing this, which was 15 years ago, I wanted to make a companion piece to that, and I was living right next to Sunset Park, had read a whole book about um, Mexican immigrants in particular settling there and the back and forth between there and Puebla in particular, and I was interested in that. So that kind of fueled the start of it for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting. It's very interesting to be on a panel with both of you, and to hear, Jim, I had no idea you wrote the script 15 years before you filmed it. Whenever I hear that, it's really helpful for me, because it helps put in perspective how difficult it is for all of us to make these films. And in my case, La Ciudad, I started as a student. I had come to New York as a film student at NYU. And I found myself living in a neighborhood that looked and felt nothing like the New York I'd really seen in movies all my life. The street I lived on, you couldn't buy the New York Times. The papers were Spanish language dailies. There were 3 of them. And I just felt this incredibly vibrant world. And then I would take the subway into school in Broadway, and I felt I was entering another New York. So it began as a student film, and it began it was an image, actually. It began with an image of a father and daughter at the Key Foods near where I lived, sitting in an old station wagon, and the girl was in the back seat, and the father had kind of a romantico ballad playing on the radio. And it looked like they were waiting for someone, presumably the mother, to come out. But the girl in the back seat was kind of swaying back and forth, and the father was completely somewhere else. They were Latin American immigrants. I didn't know where they were from, but it really, it was a strong image for me. And it led to my writing a story about a father and daughter that became the first part of La Ciudad and was a student film in my second year. And it might be worth saying up front that I was not only aware that I was an outsider to the community, I was really, I faced a lot of obstacles at NYU to make the film. My teachers did not want me to make it. They would not sign off on it because, in their words, not because of who I was as an outsider, but what effect it would have on a career to make a, quote, foreign film. I mean, the world has changed so much, but I had to fight to make the film. And the original title was The Other City. I know when I first wrote it, I wrote The Other City. And then before I got to production, I realized that just reflected a vision of New York that was fossilized, that there was no need to call where I was living the other city. In fact, in a way, the other city is the old city, and a new city was being born and continues to be born. I mean, eternally, perennially. And so the film began as a student film, and it continued as a student film. It took 6 years of work to complete it. And during those years, I changed in many ways. I changed as a filmmaker, and I also changed in terms of my understanding and relationship with the immigrant communities, Latin American immigrant communities. But the communities themselves changed radically. So that when I began filming in '92, the Mexican immigrant community was very small compared to what it would be just 4 years later. In the mid-'90s, it really began to expand with the communities from Puebla coming here in much larger numbers. And I found myself, because I was writing and directing slowly, I was trying to reflect that as it was happening. So, but that was the impetus.
That's fascinating to hear, because with Jim saying that he had been writing and working on his on the screenplay for 15 years, and you, David, having La Ciudad start as a student film, and then, what did you say, it was over the course then of several more years to turn it into a feature film. Did either of you feel at that point in time, the late 90s or early 2000s, that there was more emphasis or more focus starting to kind of grow around a recognition of the contributions of the Mexican community in the city? Or did it really feel like you were going out on a limb? I know, David, you were saying, and we'll get into the obstacles a little bit later, but that your department, your professors at NYU were a little bit standoffish or unsure of the trajectory that you would continue on if you pursued making such a film. But I'm just interested in what the environment would have been like at that moment.
I think what I would say about NYU is that they were reflecting Hollywood. They were just reflecting a very narrow vision of what film was. And it wasn't everyone there. I don't want to say all the teachers, but the key teachers did. It's kind of, if I can share a vignette in my own experience of making the film, when I started the second story, which is about day laborers, I started to go out in the mornings with an organizer named Miguel Maldonado, who's Puerto Rican. And he was trying to organize the day laborers, mostly in Queens. And there were about 8 different shape-ups or esquinas, corners where he was organizing. And I asked if I could go with him. And I remember at first arriving at these corners and seeing Miguel talk to the men and feeling like I had nothing to offer. And it took me just the first morning to realize the only way I could go back is if I had something to offer. And so I went and bought these industrial coffee makers, which probably Alexis and Jim have been using for years on film sets, but I bought them on the Bowery, and I would get up at 4 in the morning and make a huge amount of coffee and take it to Miguel's house, where we'd get in his car. So when he would speak to the day laborers, I would shout out, "Café caliente gratis." And the day laborers would come running over to get coffee and just leave. They didn't want to talk to me. They were very suspicious. Until after several months of my being essentially a source of free coffee, they really started to ask, what am I doing? And it led to this conversation about a film. But what I observed during that time is that the Latin American immigrant community, which from the outside is often a monolith, from the inside is very diverse. And it expressed itself on the street corners in dramatic ways. So that literally on one corner, the Poblanos would gather from Mexico. On another corner, the Guatemalan immigrants. On a third corner, the Ecuadorian immigrants. And they were in direct competition with each other over the wages. The contractor, the white Italian contractor arrives, and the immigrants from all 3 or 4 corners run together, and through the eyes of the contractor, they're one. But underneath that is a very complex story. What it means to be an immigrant from Ecuador and what it means to be an immigrant from Puebla are so different because of the journey that's involved, because of what it means in those days if you were deported. And so I always describe the film not as a film about the Mexican community, but about the Latin American immigrant community, about newly uprooted Latin American immigrants. But while I was filming, the community from Puebla expanded dramatically, so that by '98, it was in a way able to not rival, but present itself almost in the same footing as the old traditional Puerto Rican and Dominican communities. And that was remarkable.
And in that sense, David, as you're giving that lovely anecdote of you bringing, and I remember when we had you for a conversation at NYU as well, when we presented La Ciudad a couple of years ago, I remember hearing this story, but sorry, I need to turn off my, and bringing these huge containers of coffee to be dispensing. And so that really leads me to my next question, which is, what was the process for starting to build the relationships that would eventually lead to the films that you all made? did it start with script writing? Did it start with storyboarding, or was it really just based on being in the city, gathering your observations, making the relationships, community-based research, and then going from there? I'm interested to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in there. There's one thing that David mentioned that I think is interesting that I can relate to, which is there was a lot of resistance when I was making my film about it being a bilingual film, about it being in 2 languages. And I remember that, that was something that I really wanted to again, speaking about this fluidity between countries, I wanted to have the characters in the film be able to switch from English and Spanish quite frequently, and I there was resistance. I also went to NYU as well. This wasn't a film from NYU, but I realized even from from production, even now in distribution, the film is hard to classify. In some cases it's considered to be international film, and then in other cases it's considered to be American, sometimes also like new American. In the case of Sundance, it was also kind of, next, like kind of this like new wave of cinema. So I find it also interesting when you make films about immigrants, this, people trying to box you into specific categories, and I try to fight that as much as possible. In my case, what was interesting about the film was that both the making of it, and I can relate a little bit to David, is there was a lot of activism in terms of getting the film made, both in terms of getting, my crew was basically all of these Latin American countries represented, from Costa Rica to Cuba, to my assistant director was from to some of the actors were from Mexico. We also wanted to have Mexican actors come to New York and act. So that was something that was important for us, is to get people that had lived in Mexico City and have those actors in New York City. But there was a very kind of blurred lines between the cast and the crew, and I thought that was a really interesting aspect in the making of the film. And we hooked up with many activist groups in Bushwick that were part of. We created a rally in New York around immigration and using the monarch butterfly as a symbol. Mm-hmm. So that was amazing. And then in the science world, because I kind of dabble in that world, we had all of these immigrant scientists, all of these Hispanic scientists that said, "Oh, I want to be in the film. Can you include me in these scenes?" And so, so I thought that was really kind of amazing, kind of that, dissipating a little bit those lines between cast and crew. But yeah, that was my experience. And I will say, in my case, the film is a bit of an autobiographical film, because it's, I'm from Venezuela and France, and I ended up in New York doing a PhD in science, not knowing really where I belonged, and kind of looking through the microscope. Really looking through the microscope for answers about my own identity, where I belonged, and realizing that suddenly there was all of these people and a lot of, and actually I had a hard time connecting with my Venezuelan roots, because I resisted a little bit having all of these. I didn't like having all of these kind of backgrounds when I was younger. And it was through my time in New York doing this research, scientific research, that I sort of came to terms with having this kind of mosaic identity. And so, yeah, so that was a little bit my experience. And it also took me, 15 years to make the film, and kind of take it out of myself into this, into Son of Monarchs. So.
Yeah, and I think that carries across, is that they're obviously fiction narratives, but they're so deeply personal, and they also really do, in many ways, cross and blur the borders between what is documentary, what is fiction, and they're pointing the camera at a very real world and a very real situation here in New York City. But Alexis, it's interesting you're saying that a lot of your cast actually were people who are reaching out to you, scientists and otherwise immigrant scientists, who wanted to be a part of the film. I'm interested to hear what the casting process was like for each of you. I know that Jim and David, a lot of your casts were made up of non-professional actors. Alexis, I'm interested to hear if there was also a mix. Obviously, you're working with Tenoch Huerta, very well recognized Mexican actor as well. So what was that experience like of kind of, if you were working with non-professional actors as well, melding the two and having it work seamlessly?
Well, I'll jump in and then hand it over to David and Jim. But I think in my case, I always love to have non-actors and kind of have them mingle with actors. Tenoch got involved really early because he was really interested in playing a scientist. And actually, the reason why I got him involved in many of the Mexican actors was because of the kind of the excitement of playing different roles, and I think Tenoch almost became a producer because he started rallying, Paulina Gaitán and Noé Hernández. And there's one actor in particular that Lázaro Gabino Rodriguez, who plays his friend back home. And we were talking also about his role. And he said, I don't want to be the friend back home that never left. I want it to be kind of a choice that I never left. And I also want to be very literate when it comes to. So there was also the Mexican cast back in Mexico that was fighting the stereotypes of not being able to go, that it was more of a decision versus not going. And then I shot in Michoacan, where most of the actors in these butterfly towers where the butterflies arrive, they're all non-actors, all the kids, the teacher, so that was really important for me to kind of have that documentary aspect. And also, I think to what David was saying also, I'm not Mexican, and I think approaching it in a non-fictional way allows us as filmmakers to, to have kind of that realistic approach and kind of be more inclusive. And I think that was important for me, was to spend a few years doing research and including these non-actors as part of it. So yeah, that was a bit my experience.
I'm still thinking about 3 questions ago. I don't have anything to say at the moment. David, you go ahead and talk, and then I'll figure out what I want to say.
Okay, sure. David, do you want to tell us a little bit about your casting process and how you got your cast together for the film?
Sure. Yeah. Well, to preface it, the films that I really fell in love with and that made me go to film school were the Italian neorealist films from the 1940s. And what I loved about them was not only that they had this realism to them, these faces and sense of place that was so raw, but they were socially committed. They were not pure entertainment. They were trying to engage with the fundamental questions in Italy at the end of the war of what kind of society are we going to build? Where do we come from? Where are we now? Where are we going? But through a lyrical type of storytelling. So that combination of lyrical storytelling that is written, that's dramatically, fictionalized, and real people in real environments was so powerful. We have to remember, at the time, those films inspired filmmakers throughout the world. In the US, in Latin America, the new cinema of Latin America begins with filmmakers going to Rome to study in the Centro Sperimentale, because they didn't yet have film schools. In India, Satyajit Ray is a student of neorealism. The kitchen sink cinema from England, its roots are there. The New Wave in a strange, also has roots there. The Czech New Wave. So this was a remarkable world historical moment. And what was the experience in the US? It was utter repression from Hoover and the FBI and the state and the large media companies and Hollywood. They shut it down in the form of the blacklist and McCarthyism. And they basically said, if you want to speak about real life, you cannot do it here. The response among American filmmakers was either to leave the country or to begin the new documentary movement of the time. And so we have this break in the US. I'm saying something that will feed into what it means to cast or to work with non-actors. Is that there's a schism, and that when I arrived at film school in the early 90s, it was still very present. I had done documentaries on my own, And when I was making documentaries, everybody I worked with was deeply interested in the questions of the day. And everyone who was working in it had a social commitment. And when I arrived in NYU, it was a completely different experience. Many people were there because they loved Star Wars. Many wanted to be famous. But that those two worlds of Hollywood fiction and documentary I wanted to bring them back together. And I was looking at neorealism. So what that meant, to answer, is that I wanted to work with non-actors. And what, Alexis, what you're saying also really resonates for me. And I know from Jim's work, who's been a pioneer. I mean, Jim's films also are, there's a whole body of work now where he brings professional actors and non-actors together. But it is not, it's not simply a concept. It requires a whole nother approach to work. It requires a much deeper level engagement as a filmmaker. To work with a professional actor, the work is largely casting. It's finding Tenoch. It's finding the actor who really embodies the role. To work with a non-professional actor is finding the person who has the latent elements, the personality, the face, the look, but then spending a lot of time working with them. In my case, an enormous amount of time working in workshops, because otherwise you'll have non-professionals who really feel like they're deers in front of the headlights. So the goal, all of that was to say, I feel like we lost something. There's an amnesia in the US that we still are trying to recover. And its roots were not an accidental event. Its roots were a repressive event. And that the films that we're talking about tonight are in some ways like trying to heal that by creating fiction films that are socially engaged, that are speaking about the world, and inviting people who would never be in front of the camera in a lead role or in a significant role to play that role. I'll just add one last thing, and then Jim, I hope you'll pick it up, but it's that as I was working, I found myself kind of learning as I went, and I realized that what I wanted, I ended up calling cinema from below. I had studied history as an undergraduate, and I knew that history from below was history that didn't look at kings or queens, but looked at the common people and how they shaped the world. And I thought cinema from below could be similar, where instead of the director being at the peak of a hierarchy that's demanding and mandando everything, that the job is more to listen and try and reflect, which meant that I wasn't only casting in The Puppeteer, the first film at NYU, I really wrote it on my own. But by the time I was working with day laborers, I changed my approach and I looked to the community I was working with to help shape the story. So the writing was a collision between my experience and vision as an outsider and theirs as an insider. And if there's time today, I would love to talk about it. You know, what does it mean to have that collision? Is it necessarily a bad thing? Is it necessarily a good thing? What are the issues involved in being a quote outsider? And what does it mean to be an insider? But I went on a long time there.
No, that's
I'm finding this really
fine.
fascinating, and I'm trying to, you know, David, I think of your film as so revolutionary in terms of like it's the aesthetic of the film, just the singularity of it. Did it come out in 1998 or when?
Yeah, we filmed 92 to 97 and it came out in 98. Well, maybe it was actually in the theaters in 99.
That's so funny because I was workshopping with actors, my first film, Girls Town, as of 1993, and filming it in 95, and then it came out in 96. So, and then I had seen work by Gordon Erickson and Heather Johnston, who had made two really interesting films that they did through workshopping at that time. But I've had like a couple of the things you talked about. I've almost had a reverse experience of it, which is interesting. Like my first film I workshopped really because I hadn't written a script and I didn't really know how to write a script. So, and I was also making a story outside of my experience by making a film about teenage girls. So I was like, okay, but I had studied acting and I was interested in that idea. And I also knew about filmmakers who had done it, even though I didn't know exactly how they did it. And then with our song, I was going to do the same thing, the next film, but I just thought, you know what, I want to try writing this, and I wrote it. And there was actually very little, even though that was actors and non-actors, there was some collaboration after the script was written, but not that much. Um, but I want to, before I forget. So you were talking about the idea of like with non-actors, what is the priority? Because um, how much time do you have to spend with them before the film? Like with El Séptimo Día, it was a script we cast on the street. Our entire main cast was completely, completely had never seen a script before, had never seen a piece of paper that, so just the very first encounter, well, the very first encounter was just a conversation. And then the next one was an actual read of a scene. But actually explaining to people, like, you just read these things here, and this is the thing that says what happens, and then you read this thing, and we'll read it was really starting at that. But I had been really, for me, it's the film, the Jafar Panahi film Crimson Gold is actually playing at Film Society Lincoln Center next week. I saw that film was tremendously influential on me before I made El Séptimo Día, and the main performance, which is a non-actor performance. And I really got into the tone of films in which non-actors retain a little bit of the deer in the headlights feel, because I think it just, eventually they settle into what they're doing, obviously, but there is something like always there that is continually reminding you of what you're watching, and not trying to be the other thing. And I think I kind of assumed when I was developing and prepping my film that that's what I was going to be working with. We cast for 7 or 8 months. We played soccer together for about 4. But once we were ready to film, we had a read through of the script, and we had 1 day of rehearsing scenes with the entire group of people. And that was really it. I will say in our audition process, we had a lot of callbacks. So the callbacks themselves kind of became acting classes in a way, with adjustments and stuff. But I don't know, I was really enjoying what everybody was bringing to it. And the more they did it, the more they, so we got on set and we're blocking, and I'm thinking like I had a plan with the cinematographer. I'd say, we're going to do a lot of like wide shots. We're not going to do too much coverage. We're not going to be able to match continuity. I don't think people are going to be able to remember when they open the door of the refrigerator. It's going to be messy. Let's just try and like keep it really simple. And I'm interested in that anyway. And but as we started shooting, it became clear that they were really like, they were like, oh yeah, I go and do this, and then I say this, and your adjustments are all like, when you turn around, you're like, really listen. You got to really listen to that, and then you got to think about it for, think simple things like that. And so, at a certain point, I realized that my job was now, there were of a main cast of, let's say, 12 people. I would say maybe 3 were still kind of stuck in the very stiff, I'm not really sure what I'm doing here zone. And my job was to really work with them like a lot, to bring them up to where all the other actors were, and to try and end up with some kind of thing that was somehow in between the two, because I think that's where it ended up existing. But I look at a film like Crimson Gold, and I'm just like so entranced by the performances in that film. And And I'm pretty certain these are people who have not, you know, studied method acting. But I also, in terms of casting, and this segues with something that's happening in the news right now, is like, I knew that there was no way we were going to find real actors anyway. And, you know, the character has to lead. If you're making a film about a certain character, that has to be first and foremost, like, who is that? Who in real life, who is that? What is that character? And so, you know, we actually auditioned a couple people who had studied acting, and they were fantastic. They did the scenes, they got to the core of every scene in terms of what beats to hit, and they didn't feel at all like they had come to the United States within the last 2 or 3 years. They felt like people who had studied acting, and in fact they had. And so we were very, very specifically, you know, looking away from that. And of course we had the story point of Puebla being the point of origin for our characters. And we were literally, everyone who came in, we said, you know, where are you from? When did you come to the United States? And I think the majority of the main cast were literally from Puebla, which is getting crazily specific about what you're looking for. It wasn't like necessary. But, you know, I think that when you look at what's happening within the Heights and that conversation that's going on right now, which I've just heard only a little bit about, but I just am a little bit, I think it comes down to really Hollywood versus other, in a way, because it's crazy to me that, you know, that a lot of what we're hearing now is like, well, yes, you're right, we should have thought more about that, and we will do better next time. It's like, you know, it's not brain surgery. It doesn't take a genius to, or a you know, crazy empath to look at this and go, this isn't, you know. But look, I direct TV shows, so I'm in that world like a lot, and you realize, like, who is an actor in our world? It's not the guys who are in my film. They don't look at a movie and a TV show and go, oh, I could do that. You know, a darker skinned kid from New York City looks at what they're seeing in the movies, and they don't see themselves there. So they don't have in them, when they're early in their lives, going, I want to do that, I want to be an actor. This circular thing. And therefore the producers are always looking for the most mainstream, unthreatening, lovable by mainstream society, fucked up standards kind of type. And so they're casting in that direction as well. So, you know, and it's also, you know, Ned Beatty died the other day, and I was seeing all this, seems like it's very off topic, but I saw these tributes to him online talking about how he's a character actor, you know, one of the great character actors. It's like, Ned Beatty's a great actor, and people think of him as a character actor because he's not a matinee idol. But, you know, you look at the films of Ken Loach and Mike Leigh and other, like, you look at, and even television in England, and it's like, there's real people on screen. They look like real people. They feel like real people. And this is like an America problem. This is the United States problem, I think, where we've got this you know, gerbil reel going around and around that is like reflecting and then reflecting off of the reflection. So for me, part of the joy and the really interesting part of the experience of casting this film was walking around Sunset Park or Jackson Heights all afternoon and kind of just watching people walk, and how are they carrying themselves, you know. And it's interesting, you can look and you can go like, no, never, ever, ever, that person's not going to get in front of a camera. I can tell, just, I feel like I can tell. Maybe I'm wrong sometimes, I'm sure I am, but, and then there's another person and you're going, wow, that's real, something's really interesting about that person. They're putting something out there. But also to say, like, do they look like the description of this character, right? So but yeah, so that was a really long and like serpentine answer to that question. But I was really thrown and interested when I was on set, and we didn't have the luxury. We had a full cast of people who worked 6 days a week. And so just having them for the 4 weeks of the shoot was a nightmare, trying to actually do it. And numerous people got fired, and it was there was a lot of drama involved in that. So we were kind of like, yeah, there is no rehearsal time. Let's just start shooting. And and it was really nice to find within the film what was going on in that interesting way.
Thank you so much, Jim. No, that was fantastic. There's room for serpentine responses. That's what we're all about. So, but that's just bringing up for me more questions. Alongside the political, very much the political significance of these types of casting decisions, as you're all bringing up, of bringing in characters, bringing in people that you're observing, that you're meeting on the streets in the city, and allowing themselves to kind of shine out of their characters. The characters are there. It's the veneer, the facade of the character. But as Jim, you're saying, you're not trying to do so much rehearsal so as to erase or remove any vestige of who that person is. You're still allowing that person to be there. They're functioning with a different name, and they're interacting perhaps differently than they would have. But I think that's really incredible and very significant. Has very significant political connotations for bringing people into the films representing the community that they truly are from, communities, of course. I mean, as you're saying, Jim, you were trying to isolate and bring together people from the Poblano community here in New York, but David as well, saying that you understand La Ciudad as being more of a representation of a much broader Latin American immigrant experience in the city, and Alexis, that of your cast and crew being made up of people from all over Central and Latin America. But in that sense, I'm very interested to hear how you guys think that in what ways were you marrying, these decisions of how you're casting your films with the ways in which you were going to tell the stories, how you decided to actually portray and bring these stories to life on the big screen. They all inhabit and embody extremely different styles, and El Séptimo Día is more on the comedy side of things. It's very bright and joyous and very vivid and lively, while still, not taking anything away from the challenges and the struggles that the characters are experiencing. David spoke a little bit about the neorealist slant to La Ciudad. Is very much applying the Italian neorealist aesthetics to the city, which I think in and of itself is so incredibly radical for the moment that it was coming out, and really does kind of root La Ciudad as a landmark film. And Alexis, Son of Monarchs, is more on the melodrama side. It's a little bit moodier, perhaps a little bit more dark in some elements, and has some magical realist elements as well, and bringing in kind of different cosmologies of animist perspectives, and ways in which the human being is imagined to live in the natural universe alongside all of the species that we live amongst. And yeah, so I'm just really interested to hear from each of you the ways in which you decided to tell these stories, and how you settled on the very specific kind of overarching tones and moods and styles in and of themselves.
Well, I think to add to kind of the criterias, or how we work with these actors, I think, to the point about magical realism, one of the things that was important for me was to have, whether it was people that had experience in front of the camera or not, was whether or not they were able to kind of get into these dreamscapes, imagine imagine other forms of themselves, you know, other identities. And I think for me, even when I write the script, and there's a lot of improvisation, I'm really interested in dreams. And to some extent, as a figure, I'm the one who reenacts the dreams, you know. So a lot of the sequences in the film that are dream sequences is just me kind of, you know, acting as a translator to some of these ideas. And a lot of the children also, a lot of the improvisation that happens, all of these stories that they come up with, a lot of it is unscripted. So for me, you know, I really kind of push my actors to kind of think about these, you know, these worlds and create the fictional landscapes that they then embed themselves into. And I think, you know, it's always difficult to enter into the world of science fiction. And, you know, by the way, I'm a huge fan of Sleep Dealer, but I think it's really interesting to give the voices to these characters. Especially, it's interesting since we're talking about, you know, Mexican identities, Hispanic identities, just to let them kind of dream out loud about, you know, who they want to become, what animal they aspire to be, how they connect to the natural world, and then go in there and, you know, and help articulate it as a director and kind of create this cohesive group. So I think that's how I work with actors, and that's how I work also with writing scripts, is that once I've identified a few people that are able to kind of navigate, you know, and not self-censor themselves in terms of imagining other worlds, I then kind of have them work together, and then I kind of develop the script based on that. And that's how I then kind of get away with kind of these science fiction aspects, because it's not me really. These are dreams and aspirations that are coming from them. And one last thing, my film is about, you know, what would it mean to become a butterfly, you know, and how do we relate to this idea of navigating freely between borders. When I was shooting in Mexico in these towns, all of these kids were performers, because they do these dances for the butterflies when they arrive. They receive, you know, tourists. So they had this ability to incarnate, you know, what it was to be a butterfly. And part of the casting, because I think Jim was mentioning, is that I would just go into one of these schools and I would just ask them, like, you know, if you were a monarch butterfly, what would you do? And that was kind of one of the questions that I used to identify the you know, the non actors that were part of it. But that's how I work with script writing and also with kind of the building the characters, you know, in my film. And I think that's kind of like my Garcia Marquez, like, you know, Macondo type of thing going on there. But yeah.
Wow. Well, this, I don't know if anyone is as interested in this conversation as I am, but I really find it so, there's a number of things I'd love to speak to, and I'm not sure, Pilar, whether it's exactly your question. Do you mind though if I just respond to both of Jim and Alexis? Because
definitely.
One thing that struck me listening to Jim is that, and tell me if Jim and Alexis, this has been your experience. I feel like as directors, as filmmakers, we all have to learn this on our own. We all actually have to learn how to work with people who may not already be shaped by an industry as actors, how to meet people where they are, how to create a space where there's trust, first of all, huge, where there's a sense of safety, a willingness to explore, and then what do we do? And that we're all learning from scratch. And I know it was in my second film, the second part of La Ciudad with Day Laborers, that I actively tried to distill what I was learning into a form that I could repeat. And I teach it all over the place as a workshop, which is directing or working with non-professional actors. And what part of what interests me as a filmmaker is just demystifying. The reason I talk about bringing coffee, Pilar, is only to say that's filmmaking also. That's also directing. You know, the image of the director sitting on a chair is just, it's not helpful. Any filmmaker whose film we love has broken their back and had to go through, you know, extraordinary butterfly transformations in order to make the film. But so I concluded with casting that there are three things to look for. I just want to say them because it relates, Alexis, to what you just said about asking what animal. So on the simplest thing, we're casting for a face. We're looking at the person's face. I'm looking at Alexis's face and Jim's and yours, and they're speaking to me. They're conveying something very different, one from the other. The eyes, the countenance. So the face is the first thing, and we're doing it unconsciously very often. We're being drawn to a face. We're falling in love with the face. Jim describes walking and saying, that face, or that would never be in the film, but that face. And as filmmakers, we've had this experience of falling in love with a face, only to discover that there are many problems which are going to prohibit that from happening. But the first thing is the face. And when I'm teaching documentary, I point out that the same thing is happening with documentary filmmakers. It's just that documentary filmmakers are less willing or less trained to acknowledge these steps, that they're literally casting and they're choosing their characters rather than the reverse. But number one is the face. Number two is the personality, latent personality. What kind of butterfly would you be? And I had to learn how to discover that quickly. What do I mean by that? I mean that if I don't know you all very well. I don't know if you are, Pilar, I don't know if you're very reserved, or very outspoken, whether you have a kind of a melancholy aspect, or whether you're very bright, whether you are, when there's a fight, whether you're likely to move into the background or come forward. I don't know that. But as a director working with non-actors, I have to figure it out right away. And so it was, interestingly, it was Raoul Peck, who was he was a mentor at NYU, who gave me an exercise I continue to use, which is to bring at the time I was working with men, it works with women as well, but two day laborers together. I love both their faces, but I need to know what is their latent personality, because we cannot control our personality. When we know people well, we know their personality. We know our brothers and sisters and our wives and our friends and neighbors. We sort of know their personalities, but when you're working with people for the first time, how can you figure it out? So there are basic kind of exercises that are like dramatic exercises that will reveal within a minute or two what the personality is of each person. And then the third thing is does that person have range? Are they able to go into another personality? Or is what you see, the child who is very pensive, the child actor who has this kind of forlorn, pensive look, almost never can equally produce the spark and the laughter of the clown. Some can, but so you want to know, I'm saying this because I feel like I've had to learn it, but I've been able to apply it over and over. Face, personality, and range. And when you said like what kind of animal, I found myself using that without I would have really benefited had you talked to me in 1994, because I was casting these men from all over Latin America as day laborers. It was an ensemble piece. And I wanted the variety of characters, of animals. They couldn't all present themselves in the same way. I needed the clown, and I needed the bull, and I needed the lamb. And I eventually learned that through these kind of improvisations. So then I could say, okay, I have the face and I have the clown that align. I've got one character. I've got the face and the character of a bull. I have my second, etc. That's what I wanted to say just about, because I went through very difficult times thinking that I could get, Alexis, you said like to enter into other identities, thinking that I could get someone I'd fallen in love with because of their face and the first sense of who they are as a character, and thinking I could help work them into another place. But I learned it's only possible if they have that third ingredient, if they actually have range. And okay, that was one thought. And the other thing, I don't want to talk too long, but
and with range, I would also say endurance. The endurance is a big part of it as well. Yeah, the ability to kind of keep at it. Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. The logistical questions of endurance, commitment, whether they can be counted on. I mean, you have to create a kind of program before early on to see whether, if, for example, if you offer to meet, whether they're always there on time or not. Sometimes I would find a character, a child I love, only to discover that there's real problems at the home, and I have to look elsewhere. Well, you know, Jim, a couple things you said about, as you said, like very often it's not a choice, that you couldn't just go and cast actors for El Séptimo Día, because the people whose experience are reflected in that story are not yet, they're not yet actors. There may be one, but there's not, you're not going to find a whole group of them in New York City who've had the opportunity yet. And that's very true. But I think even when we find ourselves in a place where there are actors, looking for non-actors is still valid because of this other thing. Because there is, I put it this way, every person has the potential to give a great performance, a masterful performance. That is, everyone has the potential to be a great actor, but only in the very, very limited experience of their own life, their own story, and their own personality. A great actor, when we talk about actors who are great, it's that they're able to give an equally truthful performance over and over and over in a variety of different characters. But that if the conditions are there, non-actors, non-traditional, non-professional, can give us that, you know, enduring performances that we've all lived with. And one last thing is, I guess, again, touching on the idea of insider or outsider, I think the question of what does it mean to be an outsider needs to be discussed with real, needs to be examined with real depth. And one of my mentors on this is the writer John Berger, the English writer, who left England and moved to a small village in France in his 40s and spent the rest of his life there. And he wrote a trilogy called Into Their Labors. The first part was called Pig Earth, and it's fiction, but it's rooted in the lives of these French peasants. He described the project as trying to express the inner lives of the last rooted peasants in Europe, or campesinos, the last rooted communities, the last communities that hadn't yet been uprooted. It would be, in a sense, like going to some of the villages in Mexico whose children and parents are working now in New York, to go to that community. He went there and he spent the rest of his life there. And he opens Pig Earth with the question, who am I as an outsider to write about these people? And he literally makes a split on the page. And on the left, he says, what do we have in common? And on the right, what separates us? What is our difference? He wants to begin by acknowledging, without judgment, both sides. So for example, he says, an outsider brings to every community an opportunity, because things that never need to be said within the community, that quote, go without saying, need to be said to someone who's from outside the community. Therefore, the very presence of someone from the outside can cause a relationship that gives voice to something in a new way. He said that every child is an expert in the presence of an outsider. He looked at the ways in which the perspective of an outsider and the perspective of an insider are, in a way, mirror images of each other. The outsider brings knowledge of a far away world that may not be known within the community, but complete ignorance about the world in the community. And someone within that community might have just the opposite. So he describes this as a mirror, and then he describes what I have felt to be, well, it's really the spirit and the approach that I've taken in the few films I've made, which is to recognize that at that point where an outsider and insider meet is a place of great possibility, a place where a certain kind of truth that embodies both of those experiences can exist, but it's also full of risk. And the obvious risk was defined for me when I was at NYU, my very first film that I was shooting in the South Bronx. And my production teacher in front of a class of 60 said, look, this is for everyone. The first stop you're gonna make when you're doing your pre-production as a producer in any neighborhood in the city is the police station. You're gonna go to the local precinct. You go in there, you tell them you're with NYU, you're gonna be making a film, and they will organize through the city to have police on the street to keep people away, so you control the street. That's one version of the outsider, and it's actually the Hollywood model. It is a model that is driven by necessity and the lack of time or interest. The other model is to actually start in Sunset Park a year before or 15 years before and start listening and start building relationships from the inside out. But in every one of those relationships, as an outsider, your very presence is an opportunity for things to be expressed and articulated. So I'm kind of, because I often find the question of insider outsider is simplified into an orthodoxy that is not equally limited, but it's limiting in its own way to the possibilities that people who have chosen to be storytellers. And I would say this, by the way, even our definition of community is often oversimplified. That image of the day labor pool that from the outside appears to be a unified, coherent Latino or Latinx community, from within is filled with divisions. The same is true in every community. Divisions between those who own, those who don't, men, women, young, old. There's all these, to me, there's like concentric circles within a community. Even within our own communities, we're outsiders. I'm an outsider in the world of my home, which is a home of women. So that, talk about a long digressive answer.
No, thank you so much, David. Jim, we'd love to hear from you. I want to get back to this idea of the insider and the outsider and the collision that creates, which David, you're bringing up in one of your previous answers as well, and whether or not that's necessarily a bad thing, or as you're saying, that precisely that point of encounter is a moment for great possibility. But Jim, can you tell us a little bit more about how you decided on the overarching tone for En el Séptimo Día? And also respond to David or anything else that you like.
Because I didn't, like I said, I mean, I definitely was influenced by a form that I was really enjoying watching. The film didn't end up taking that form necessarily, as we discovered while we were shooting it, different ways to operate. And it was really, this one really was that type of film, which I hadn't done since the first one, since Girls Town, where you really have a limited pocket of time and you're learning as you go. And, you know, there's a filmmaker, I don't remember who it is now. I had read a thing at one point that said that vendors would always, at the last day of the shoot, he would always reshoot what they shot on the first day. Because, so the first day was like throwaway. And this may be like a completely false story, or maybe it was another filmmaker, but I was interested in that idea because it's true. Like your very first day, you're really you're warming up. You know, you're in the batter's box, you're in the on deck box or whatever. So it was a real kind of like discover as you go. You know, oh yeah, we thought we're going to use a lot of really long lenses for these sequences, but actually it's feeling better this way. Or actually we were going to do this other thing, but we can't because it's not safe, because we've realized someone's going to get killed riding this bike through the traffic the way we want to shoot it. So, a lot of it was that. I think what I would one of the things I was thinking about when either in that question or right before it was just like, was thinking about where are you going with this film? Why are you making it? And what is what's out there already? Like, I think that there's definitely a really, what is it like? What is a foreign film? I know that in a sense, we, I took a number of steps with our film to that were kind of stubborn. I want to do it this way because it's important kind of steps, which has bit me in the ass in the past numerous times. And I think did in this regard as well. Like I was really insistent upon the title of the film being in Spanish because I felt like it's, I don't know. I kept saying, "Y tu mamá también." Come on, it was a big hit, but I think I really like underestimated. Um, so, and then there's this idea: what is a foreign film? Like, are we, because we were put in the category of a foreign film, and I was like, but our film was made in New York, and it's made with New Yorkers. Everybody lives in New York. Like, this is a United States film. And it just goes to show, though, how we still look at the United States as white, English speaking. That's the category. It's not US. It's, so anything outside of that is like foreign. And I felt like we were closer to being a little bit past that. And then also a decision to subtitle the film with both English and Spanish subtitles all the way through. And I had this, I did have, and which actually played out in certain idyllic circumstances in like Los Angeles, in New York, in Chicago, where we had audiences that had people who didn't speak English and people who didn't speak Spanish. And for me, it's like, and again, I thought about In the Heights this week. It's just as like, um, like, in order to make change and move forward, you have to go not just a step at a time. You have to kind of go a couple steps. And those films have the power to do that. They actually do, because they have money and they have draw already, and it's clear why they don't. But anyway, I think the other thing is like, certainly as a outsider creator in this circumstance, but also understanding the community you're working with, but also the audience for that movie, I'll always remember this conversation I had at October Films when they were getting ready to release my first film, Girls Town, because we were talking about audience and like, how are we gonna like reach this audience? And they were just talking about a Russian film that they had acquired, and they were very excited about it. And they did a couple special screenings out in by Coney Island, and they had like premiere type stuff with food and everything, and they had these huge audiences, and everybody loved it, and they were so excited. And the film opened the next week, and it completely bombed, and no people from that neighborhood went. And this realization that like a lot of times, there is a certain reality to the fact that a lot of people who come to the United States from other places, they come here because they want to see Marvel movies, or they like the idea of Hollywood. They like the idea of everything that the United States like was presenting to them, and they oftentimes don't want to watch a realist movie about their lives. We go to the movies to escape, and people who immigrate go to the movies to escape as well. And I was very aware of that. And I think that's also where I was trying very hard to work humor into the film and have it be something that was fun to watch, and like subvert some of the the politics in a way that I didn't necessarily on some of my earlier films. And so all those things I was just kind of aware of, and you know, oh, I don't know, I really don't really read the news very much. I kind of read headlines, but it seems like I'm mentioning all this stuff. But there was an article out a couple of days ago about um, Pantaya and is that what it's called? Yes. And Netflix, maybe. Um, and how they profiled a couple in LA, and the woman, and they were both, I think they were both, no, they were both from Central America, or I think, and the woman liked fluffier stuff and reality shows, and the guy liked more interesting, deeper shows. And so they were trying to figure out, who are they? And they were doing this whole study with them. And I was kind of, and how there was nothing really it was hard to find stuff for both of them, and I was just kind of like, show them my film. I think maybe they could have a good night. Like, I wanted to actually send them the film, because that, I think, in a weird way, was what I was hoping for with my film. I was hoping to make a film that could could be for both audiences in different ways, but equally satisfying on different levels. I don't think I think about that while I'm writing. I'm thinking about writing a story, and what I want the story to be. But I think there was there was a lot about the making of it, and certainly about the putting out of it, that I wanted to keep that in mind. And I don't think we figured anything out in a big way that is that helpful. But I just do hope. And also, Alexis, like what you're talking about, having a whole different kind of immigrant experience with your character, which again, I think is really, I thought about that a lot when I was making my film, and how, the focus of the political system here in the United States is so often about, on different levels, it's, yes, it's easier to go back and forth when you're in a certain strata. But how we look at people, and who we say yes to, who we say no to, what those people's experiences are, and how they're not always how we generalize them either. And so that you can be here and not be making a lot of money and doing a really difficult job, but be having a great fucking time and be extremely happy and be a great neighbor and be out there in your community doing stuff, and vice versa, and so that's another reason why I'm interested in your film, is to just continue to see new and different and other aspects of this experience.
I just to add to that, to what Jim was saying, I remember when I was showing the film in its rough stages, I had like two things that were coming together. One was this idea of the hero's journey and the hero's struggle. And in addition to that, people were like, well, we don't feel like your character, because of also how Hispanics and Mexicans are often portrayed in film. They're like, he's not going through any struggles. He seems to have a comfortable life. He seems, and for a long, it took me a while to realize that I was okay with that. But definitely other outsiders, or, again, it's a really interesting conversation about outsider, insider, but they were trying to enforce that into my film, saying that, we really need to see that struggle. And it took me a while, because obviously, you're very kind of impressionable as you're editing. And, but I sort of came to terms with the fact that, no, he's, the conflict that he's having is very internal, but on the exterior, things are going relatively well for him. And I wanted that to be, something that is okay. And I realized that it was, if I hadn't shot it in kind of this independent way, I was kind of going against the grain on many people saying, we need to see much more struggle from this character. And I think, without projecting too much, I think that the fact that he was Mexican Hispanic also led to all of these stereotypes and cliches about what people, you know, their desires or what they wanted to see or what they were used to seeing. And it was interesting. And to another point that Jim was saying is the whole idea about a foreign film or a niche film or an experimental film. I find that what David was saying also is that either people want to assimilate it as being something like, you know, like new American cinema or like avant-garde, or they want to relegate it into the category of foreign. But there is kind of like this discomfort in being in this kind of realism, or, you know, and I find that all the time in my work that people say like, oh, you make very niche films, or your films are very targeted. And, you know, I never intend to make my films for a niche audience. It's never my intention. But I find it interesting that when you're kind of depicting these stories, you're either relegated to the foreign category, or you're, you know, in this kind of like yeah, new wave type of thing. And so it's kind of like both extremes are there. But
I also think that in the United States, people are much more likely, like, I think foreign also somehow translates to like romantic.
exotic, yeah, exactly.
And I think that, you know, any neo-realist film to some degree, or any film involving a serious topic, you know, I'd rather go see the people in the nice costumes with the umbrellas, or, you know, or it could even be Slumdog Millionaire, which on a certain level is romanticized. Look, I remember liking the film, but it's romanticized poverty on a certain level. It's very interesting to see. I think that people will choose a foreign film that they don't know really anything about, that they don't know, there's not big stars in it, over a US film that might be very, very similar. And I think also part of it is having to do with being burned in the past by well-intentioned American independent film, which is a reality. I mean, I think people have seen enough small little kind of good for you American independent films that they really artistically haven't been satisfied with, so that they're not going to take a chance on it. And it is a good bet to go, let's go to Brazil for an hour and a half, or let's go to Belgium for an hour and a half, you know. I don't know, it's an interesting anecdotal observation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's fantastic is that the visual styles and cinematography, of course, of your films are so different, but the beauty is that you've all produced hyper-local stories of individual people's experiences, more or less, here in New York City. But at the same time, in addition to that, you've contributed more layers to this so-called, quote, standard, unquote, immigrant narrative, and at the same time are challenging what that narrative can be, as well as the ways in which it can be told. But I really want to go back to this idea. We'll have a few more questions and see where we're at then, but of the insider-outsider, and kind of go a little bit deeper into each of your more personal experiences, perhaps on the ground making the films, what you would say were the most specific challenges, but at the same time, the most explicit benefits or attributes or advantages of coming from that perspective. I know, Jim, you were mentioning that it gives you a little bit more of an inside look at one's audience, and perhaps also, I think if the three of you had in mind, these films are, of course, without being explicitly political, they are political in their significance. So thinking about the kind of messaging or what you're trying to communicate to specific audiences, and just interested to hear.
I guess I'll jump in. I'm really fascinated by the outsider insider, and speaking about John Berger, there's a great piece about why look at animals, and animals as spectacle and how they reflect on our own selves. And it's, yeah, John Berger is definitely Yeah.
Alexis, the documentary that was made of that film, of that book, originally had a voiceover in the traditional outsider voice. The filmmaker had written a voiceover that was as a in the tradition of the David Attenborough.
Yeah, David Attenborough, anthropomorphic, or
John Berger watched that film with the director in the edit room at 8 p.m. one night and realized it was a disaster. And he asked if he could just have one night to write an entirely new voiceover from the first point perspective of an animal. And it transformed the film, and you can see that. So this story, this subject is a perennial one.
No, I mean, I think that in my work, what's interesting is that there's a sense of, because I come from the science world, there's a sense of, you're outsider, insider is something, it's almost like a statement, saying like, I'm from the outside, because obviously there is no such thing as really kind of that division between both. But by stating that, you create this illusion of being impartial or being able to observe the world from the perspective of, in my case, of a scientist or from afar. And I think in my case, that was a big part of the actual character, which I was kind of like the doppelganger. I was kind of the mirror image of Tenoch, because Tenoch is an outsider, right? And that's actually what he's struggling with, is whether he's an outsider, whether he's an insider. And of course, because he spends his day observing the world literally from above, through a microscope, or trying to understand life, there is a sense that he's trying to, to remove the emotion, or remove kind of this the subjectivity in the way he studies life, and he's trying to then put that into his own life, and trying to understand his own existence. And I think that's, I was kind of projecting myself into his character, and he goes back home, and ultimately it's through this ability to kind of navigate between being outside and inside that he starts understanding who he is, right? Not to give too much away in my film, he starts also changing his outside appearance. He starts tattooing butterfly pigment onto his body. And so there's a sense of him trying to also kind of change his own exterior kind of aesthetic in the film. But I think it's, for me, just to add to everything that David and Jim were saying, I think it's interesting to kind of, you pose yourself that as like a statement saying like, I'm gonna be an outsider, or I'm gonna be an insider. And based on that, there's a whole set of criteria and ways in which you navigate making a film or creating a story. And I think, and I think that's really what I'm interested in a lot of the work that I do. And I think, I don't kind of make the distinction between my role and the character's role. It was very, very much kind of blurred between those two worlds. But the other thing to what David was saying is, even if you're an outsider, looking inside, or whatever the context is, you should be able to move back and forth. You have moments where you're inside, you have moments where you're outside, and that's the lives that we live. There are moments where we can relate, and there are moments where we extricate, and sometimes we want to be an outsider because that's the way we cope with trauma, we cope with feelings. We need to remove ourselves. So it's, for me, really fascinating. And I think working with non-actors, that's something that I tend to do as well. Sometimes I say, like, I want you to feel this moment. And in other cases, I tell them to be extremely cold and removed, almost like the stranger in Camus, like Albert Camus, like really just like, apathy, like no emotion in terms of how they see things. And so, so anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but it's something that is very kind of particular to my worlds. And I'm really interested in this duality between outsider and insider.
Thank you, Alexis. David, if you have anything to add, or Jim,
one thing I want to say is, Pilar, you're doing an amazing job on keeping us on track, because we're all going in our own directions. But one thing that really I found amusing is that Alexis is saying people were looking at his film and saying, why isn't there more suffering? Why isn't there more struggle? when La Ciudad came out, some of the voices that I would hear when I traveled with the film from within the Latin American community, but tended to be Latinos who were already well established, were saying, we need more success. You know, this film is showing all suffering, but why aren't you showing the success? So it's ironic that because it's a process of becoming. Immigration and uprootedness is a process both of leaving one place and of entering another. And even if you go back and forth, I ended up moving to southern Mexico, to Oaxaca, and raising my children there. I was there for many years, and long enough to begin to see the world that I had been in New York City from the opposite side, from the villages that are, they're not abandoned, but many of them are missing half the population. And I found myself being asked to photograph, for example, the bathrooms or the roofs that were being built in these homes for the migrants in Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York, because they wanted to see how their home was going that they were building back in the village. But the whole village is just filled with these homes that no one is living in. They're being built for a return someday, but that return becomes less possible with every day with every year that passes, because the immigrant from Oaxaca now has children that are born in Queens, and they don't want to go back to that bath that the father spent his whole life, or the mother trying to build. So this process of migration and immigration, even the word migrant and immigrant is a fascinating one. On the question of insider outsider, it is a fact that in my life, film and television has been more destructive and damaging than it has been enlightening. From the time I was a little kid growing up, film and television told me so many falsehoods and myths and lies about everything. And for me personally, what it meant to be, you know, a boy, what it meant to be a man, what it meant, what kind of relationship was possible with other boys or with girls, what it meant to be from the United States or from the North. The impact of film and television has been so destructive historically that there's every reason today to have a rebellion against these outsiders, people who for the last 100 years have dominated the discussion. I fully understand it and I embrace it. I love that now when I go on Netflix, subtitles are almost not an issue. I'm watching TV series with Hindi subtitles and with Portuguese subtitles and with Norwegian subtitles, and that was not at all the reality 25 years ago. But I am worried that we may be headed in a place where new orthodoxies replace the old ones that are also really limiting, and that the question of how we approach our work is getting lost to who we are. I mean, in terms of that question, who we are in terms of class, race, gender, et cetera, language. This Trinidadian Black Caribbean sociologist who taught in England when I grew up in London, named Stuart Hall, would say always, when I ask someone where they're from, I expect a very long answer. And what he meant was, I'm interested in knowing your story. I want to understand your experiences and your past and how you are shaped, not only by the physical body you're in, but by the experiences you've had. And I would just add to that when you talk to me about your approach to work, I want a very long answer too, because I believe the key to redressing 100 years of destructive film and television is not just to go for an essential identity approach in storytelling, but it is to be very deliberate and clear about what it means to speak about anyone whose experience is different than your own, in whatever way it may be different. And it's a conversation that will go on and is being, it's really breaking open in new ways right now. I mean, I feel the excitement at that. I'm seeing stories being told from different parts of the world in a new way, but I don't want to lose that question of how we approach our work. To me, is as important as where we come from. What in writing classes, the question, the mantra has always been write what you know. But there's another question, which is what can you learn? You know, if you're born as a boy, can you ever really write what the experience of your sister is? Well, not if you don't listen, not if you don't pay attention, not if you're not aware that you are not your sister, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted to talk about the tone of La Ciudad, but that's a much less probably interesting thing than this. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, David.
I'm not going to give the long answer of who I am, but my answer to this question usually is really long because I end up stepping in it over and over again. I feel like in the end, the film speaks for itself, number one. I think for me, that's like essential. I think people who make films, people who write what they know can write great material and they can write awful material and vice versa, you know. So ultimately, I think however you would arrive at it, the film itself, and you know, and as you say, no one's ever going to please everybody with any film anyway. There's always going to be someone saying, well, why didn't you show this in there? And why didn't you show that in there? And wait, you didn't show this, or I didn't, that wasn't my experience, you know? But, you know, on and El Séptimo Día, I mean, David told a story earlier on about watching this girl in the car with her dad. And I was like, I connected with that very deeply because many of the scenes in my films come from that, basically. I'm sitting on a subway and I'm all the way down the car, but I'm watching something happen. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what it is, but I make up, that becomes my characters right there. And then I do know what it is, but it's probably not what's really happening, but I'm reading the body language, I'm watching, and then I go off into my own thing. And then it becomes mine, it becomes my scene. And that is really how so much of what I do starts, and as an ultimate outsider as well. I mean, and then as you go further on, you know, the question is, well, how much do you need to like learn, and how much you need to collaborate, and how much do you want to? And I've had very, very different versions of that, you know, from film to film. But I will have to say, like on my last film, my outsider status was probably higher than it was on a lot of the other ones, because I'm not fluent in Spanish, and I can communicate on certain levels, and I was able to, and I was also, you know, I think on my main cast, probably, you know, half of the actors spoke good enough in elementary English to speak with me, and I spoke almost good enough Spanish to speak with them when I needed to, but I'm not fluent, and you know, I thought about that a lot. I wrote the script in English, we translated it. It was, you know, run through lots of cycles in the translation, but I was aware, you know, a good friend of mine was in Ken Loach's film Land and Freedom, and you know, Ken worked with a cast of actors from like 7 different countries in that film, and he didn't speak a word of anything other than English. And And most of that film was improv as well. So how about that? But I think it's an amazing film, and somehow he did it. And then I know that when I studied acting, I was in acting classes with half the class were usually people from other countries who were here to study with my acting teacher. And if and when their English was not really sophisticated enough to allow them to do a scene where they were thinking about their language rather than the scene, the teacher would ask them to just do it in whatever language they spoke. She, however, didn't speak anything other than English, but she would watch that scene and then she would give it a 15-minute critique and she would talk them through because she knew what the scene was. And I wrote this script. I knew what the scenes were. And on a weird level, there was something almost freeing about it because I didn't have to sit there as a writer and go, oh, they inverted those two words or whatever. I was able to actually just watch actors interact, watch their bodies, watch where they were and how they moved, whatever. So again, I don't recommend it. I wouldn't want to do it again, really. But for me, the biggest loss about that I don't think really affected the film in the end. Of course it affected the film, but for me, the biggest loss was socially. And as you know, everything I work on for me is an opportunity to learn and an opportunity to expand my being. And not being able to sit on the grass outside the football field, at lunch break and converse with everyone. And I also felt bad when people started speaking English because I was there and I knew they didn't really want to speak in English. So I had great times and I had great communications, but I lost out on that level. And that for me has always been difficult. I have a language block and I've tried. So anyway, the more I talk, the more I'm like burying myself. But I still think that, yes, you can see things from outside that you can't see from in, and vice versa. And in the end, what's really important is, what does the story say? Did you do your homework? Did you respect the characters? Did you respect the story? And did you make a beautiful film that, that tells us the story you intended to tell and that people want to see? Ultimately, that's the most important. So yeah, it's something I've dealt with from day one in the work that I do. And sometimes it's worked better than other times. But I'm kind of always learning. So.
Thank you so much, Jim. I think that is actually a perfect note to end on. Unfortunately, I wish that we could keep going for another hour, but we're a little over time. If we weren't doing this virtually, then we would have the opportunity to continue the conversation off the physical stage, but unfortunately we're bound by this. But thank you all so much for your insights and contributions and for this incredible conversation. Again, it's bringing up so many more potential avenues that we could continue down, but in the sake of time, we'll just thank you guys so much for joining us. And to the audience, I just want to remind everyone watching that the Mexico on the Hudson series will be available to stream. The films will be available to stream through Tuesday, June 29th. You can register on our website for free at cinematropical.com. And thank you.